Hello, everyone, and Happy New Year. Welcome to FCC's virtual event, Financial Confidence, Empowering Women on the Farm. I'm your host, Caitlin Dubin, and I am so excited to be here with you today. I myself am a grain farmer from Southern Alberta. I'm a storyteller, and I'm a community builder. I have had the absolute privilege of celebrating the incredible stories of women in agriculture through my podcast, the Rural Woman Podcast, since 2019. Due to the popularity of the FCC Women series, they have decided to extend the series and bring you another 5 episodes throughout the year. So whether you are joining us for the first time today or you've been with us before, I'd like to thank you all for being here with us today. While today's session is being delivered virtually, wherever we find ourselves in Canada, we are on traditional Indigenous territories with rich traditions, stories, and histories that we have an opportunity to be curious about and honor. We acknowledge and give gratitude to the many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit who have lived in and cared for these lands for generations. We acknowledge the traditional knowledge keepers, the elders, both past and present, and are grateful for their contributions that help keep this land beautiful. We make this acknowledgement as an act of reconciliation. Over the next hour, you'll hear from our speaker, Chantel Chapman, who will discuss the importance of building financial knowledge and confidence in women on the farm. Some housekeeping before we start. This session will be recorded and a link will be sent out via email to everyone who has registered. If you need to leave early or you want to share this with your family or friends afterwards, the link to the replay will be sent to you in a few days. If you have any technical questions, there is a blue support button on the lower part of your screen. And you may have noticed there is a chat on the right-hand side of your screen. So please drop a hello in there and let us know where you are dialing in from today. Beside the chat, there is a Q&A box, so feel free to ask any questions you have in there, and I will ask Chantel your questions at the end of the session. The Q&A is moderated, and your questions can be asked anonymously, so please don't be shy. There is also going to be polling questions which will be posted throughout the presentation, and you can participate in those beside the Q&A box. So please take a quick moment to make yourself comfortable with all of the technology that's happening, and I will introduce you to our keynote speaker, Chantel Chapman. She is a trauma survivor and a financial trauma educator who created the Trauma of Money method after discovering her own money patterns were linked to complex PTSD. As the founder and CEO of the Trauma of Money Institute, she leads an international certification program that has trained thousands of professionals in over 22 countries. Chantel is also the author of her book, The Trauma of Money. And stay tuned to the end as we will be able to give a few copies of her book away to you lovely ladies today. Please help me welcome Chantel to the stage.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be with you all today. And I'm excited to dive into what does financial confidence for women on the farm look like? Before I get started and tell you a little bit about myself, I just want to share something that we call community agreements in the trauma of money space. This is just some disclaimers and some ways of how we're going to interact today, just to create a sense of agency for you in this space. I think even hearing the name of my book, Trauma of Money, those are 2 words that are so heavy and impactful. I'm sure just even being here and hearing those words, you're probably noticing an experience in the body. Maybe you're noticing some nausea in the stomach or some tension in the chest or some curiosity or some potential fear. So this is just going to help support some safety and agency in this space. And the first one is consent and privacy. At all times throughout this entire presentation, you have the right to decide on your degree of participation. So what that means is if I put a poll question forward or I ask a question, you get to decide if you want to answer that poll or not. And it's completely at your own pace. You also get to decide if you need to step away for a moment or if you need to leave early. All personal stories, experiences, and conversations shared in this space, maybe through the chat or through polling, is going to be done anonymously, as Caitlin mentioned. So there's a layer of protection even in the setup of this space. The next is advocating for our needs. So I'll do the best to prioritize the safety and care of my nervous system on the journey, even if that means I need to step away. So this is a reminder as you're experiencing emotional responses in this session, which are so normal, by the way. It's so normal to get activated when we talk about money. It's very normal to get activated when we talk about shame or trauma or any of the things that I'm going to bring up. What's really important during the activation is that when you notice it, you're doing something to advocate for your needs in that moment versus the suppression of it. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how women, especially, are very trained to suppress, especially in the workplace. Suppress your emotions, especially with money. Money is math. Suppress the emotions in money. So a big practice that we do in trauma of money and in this work is we identify the response and we advocate for our needs. As a psychoeducation program, trauma of money is not a substitute for mental health care or medical care. And we're also not providing investment advice today. Another thing I want to say is to expect non-closure on this topic. We only have an hour together today, and I have 65 hours of content and research that I usually teach. And one thing I will share a little bit more about me is I am a recovering people pleaser, and I want to give you as much information as possible, but in this short amount of time, we can only hit certain aspects of this work, which is quite deep and the scope is pretty large. So I just want to invite this idea that we're not going to have closure on every topic today. Today is more of a session to invite you into a level of awareness of the possibility that some of the things I'm going to introduce may be present. And then that's an invitation for you to go on a journey to explore it in your own capacity, safety, and pace that feels good for you. So a little bit about me. My name's Chantel Chapman. I'm the CEO and the founder of the Trauma of Money Institute. And I'm an author of an international best-selling book called The Trauma of Money. And I actually come to this work from a finance background. And my journey is a little interesting in meeting this work because I was a media spokesperson for a very large fintech company in Canada. I was a financial literacy educator. I knew how to work with money pretty well. I was pretty confident in the way I was working with money, but I had these behaviors with money that were the opposite of what I was teaching that I felt quite a bit of shame around, that it didn't matter how much financial literacy I had, I couldn't shift the behaviors. And a lot of the behaviors kind of fell under this umbrella of something we call financial fawning, which I'll talk about a little bit later, but they would manifest as like lack of boundaries around money, not able to negotiate, under earning. So like everyone was getting a discount, everyone was getting a deal. I had a hard time asking for more money and also overspending as a way to kind of like fit in. I would always say I would like use my money as a please, love, and accept me fund. And so here I am, a public figure teaching about money, but behind the scenes, I had all these behaviors that no amount of financial literacy could shift. And that's really what really put me on this journey of trying to understand like why can't the financial literacy that I'm teaching shift these behaviors? How can I know better? But how am I not shifting my behaviors? And that's where I went on my own journey of understanding what really does impact our relationship with money, what really does impact our financial confidence. And what came out on a multi-year research journey was how I grew up. I grew up in poverty with a single mother. This is me and my mom's best friend, and these two beautiful women raised me for the first 5 years of my life. And I love this photo so much because they kind of look like they're dressed to go out to like a party, but they're like, let's stop at Sears and get a family photo first, which I think is pretty cute and funny. But growing up in an environment where there was some chaos and poverty and scarcity, it really did impact the way I showed up around money. And I had developed these two very strong beliefs. One, money equals safety. If my mom would have had money when I was a child and scarcity wasn't present, I would have been safe. And then two, I'm not worthy of money. So those two core beliefs were really what was behind so many of the behaviors. And as I started unpacking some of my own individual experiences that I went through that shaped my relationship with money, I started also looking at the collective experiences that we have around money and how those are showing up. So even from a gender standpoint, as a woman, I also carried a belief that I couldn't be trusted with money. And why is that? Well, it wasn't that long ago that a woman couldn't get access to credit without a male cosigner. So when that is in our consciousness, it's very easy for these beliefs like you can't be trusted with money to arise. And then these can impact some of the ways we make decisions around money. And through this research of the macro and the micro, when it comes to the creation of narratives or trauma experiences, this is where I created the Trauma of Money Institute. And now we're the go-to place where therapists, social workers, financial professionals get trained in trauma sensitive and psychologically safe approaches to money. So, why does this matter? Why does this matter for women working on the farm? One thing we know is that in agriculture, there's a lot of uncertainty. There's market volatility, there's climate risk, there's debt cycles, and financial decision making in this context is shaped not only by information, but by stress, identity, and relational dynamics. And often there's some very, very overlooked dimensions when we think about our relationship with money. There's so much programming in our society that says your relationship with money is all about financial literacy, the amount of financial literacy you had access to, and it's about math. And we've been really programmed to take the emotions out of it. But there's so much going on. There's so many dimensions that we're not really looking at. One of them is invisible labor, invisible value. So women's work on the farm might be framed as helping rather than recognized as skilled economic contribution. And we know through the dominant economic culture that we live in that there's a lot of entitlement to a women's care, to a women's help, to women helping. And so that entitlement to a women's care can minimize it, can minimize the economic contribution. And this invisibility leads to undercompensation, limited ownership, recognition, and exclusion from financial decision making. Over time, beliefs can arise that say, like, I shouldn't ask for more. I can't be trusted with money, making it harder to claim income, equity, or long-term security. The next is the pressure to keep the peace. Many women are conditioned to keep the peace in the family. This often shows up as overgiving, absorbing risk, or staying silent around money, leading to disproportionate debt, avoided conversations, and sometimes risk taking because we have unsustainable financial arrangements. This is something I really found myself in a lot, where I wasn't able to advocate for my needs when negotiating around like even getting credit. And because of that, I would find myself almost taking a bit of too much financial risk because I didn't feel confident enough to ask the questions or to challenge what maybe the financial advisor was saying. And then the last dimension that feels important is the weight of uncertainty. So farming brings constant uncertainty, as I mentioned before, and women carrying a lot of emotional labor along operational demands can lead to hypervigilance, shut down around money, or a focus on like short-term decision making. instead of seeing kind of like the longer term vision. And another thing that can come out of this is burnout and health impacts. We know that women are disproportionately impacted by autoimmune diseases. And we also know that there's a very strong correlation to stress and the suppression of our authentic self and these autoimmune diseases. So I just want to acknowledge this is probably feeling like, oh, a lot, heavy, heavy. You might even be resonating with some of this. And if you're noticing a response in the body, I'm just going to invite what we call a somatic interlude, which is just a moment to give the nervous system some support. So the way we can practice that together in this moment is I'm going to invite you, if it feels accessible to you, to do something that we call a physiological sigh. So this is where we breathe in through the nose and sigh out through the mouth. Beautiful. And I'm going to invite you to do 2 more of those, breathing in through the nose and sighing out through the mouth. And on this last one, I'm going to invite you to see what it's like for yourself to really extend that sigh and maybe notice like your shoulders just drop into your chair as you sigh out. So inhaling through the nose and sighing it out through the mouth. Beautiful. This is a little tool for you that you can use as we're going through the journey together today. If you're feeling like a little tension in the body, what is it like to bring your attention back into the breath? And I would love for us to take a moment to find connection with each other by offering a poll. So in a moment, a poll is going to come up, and this poll is about harmony versus sustainability. So in financial or farm related decision, what feels most familiar to you? Keeping the peace even if it costs me, taking on more responsibility than feels fair, waiting until things feel urgent before speaking up, feeling comfortable naming my needs, or it depends on the situation. So let's just take a moment and do that poll. All right. Thank you so much for participating in the poll. I'm getting some results back, and I can see that the most common response is taking on more responsibility than feels fair. Yeah. So most of us here are relating to taking on more responsibility than feels fair. Yeah. Is there a second one, one that came in second place? And then it depends on the situation is the last one. Yeah, beautiful. All right. So before we get into a little deeper into the presentation, I just want to talk a little bit about integration. So I've introduced some overlooked dimensions around our relationship with money, and you already might be resonating with some of what I'm sharing. And oftentimes, when the brain resonates with something and you start feeling seen in this experience, the brain is like, okay, yeah, that's me. Now what do? I need my like takeaway steps. And it's super important for me to name in this work that this takeaway steps and the integration, 50% of it is just awareness. Just being able to identify, wow, I notice that I feel like I'm really taking on more responsibility than I want to right now. Or I notice that I'm feeling activated when I have to have this conversation around money. So much of the integration is just naming it. One thing we say in the trauma healing world is we name it to tame it. So much is naming. So I really want to just highlight that because I don't want you to feel like you have to have all these different steps to be able to work with this in the beginning. Right now, awareness is okay. We are often looking for very clear takeaway steps, as I mentioned, but we are really focusing on building awareness of the emotional and systemic factors, such as generational stress or the invisibility of women's labor that drives financial behaviors. By naming these dynamics, that supports 50% of the integration process. And the naming really supports the nervous system to help you move from being a reactor to being an actor with more agency. Yeah. And our work, we're very non-prescriptive in our work because we really value this idea of discernment. And we really value empowering you to move past financial shame and make choices that feel really in alignment with your value system and your worth and your community. So instead of another to-do list that you come out of this training with, think of this as cultivating the soil of your financial well-being so you can lead with confidence and resilience. So let's talk a little bit about financial shame. So in the Trauma of Money Institute, we kind of have a tagline, and I even have it in art as my wall on my wall because it's so important. We say everything we do in this work is meant to help us decrease shame and increase discernment. The more we're able to decrease our shame, it allows our brain to be more discerning, or it allows us to have the ability to choose well. And then the more discerning we're able to be, as that goes down, it allows us to also or as that goes up, it allows us to also decrease our shame. So I have a question, and we're going to bring up another poll. Have you ever felt financial shame? Have you ever felt it before? And remember, this is anonymous, so no one will see what your answer is, but I'm curious, have you ever felt financial shame? And I would love to know if if you're seeing a percentage of who has felt financial shame in the group once the results come in. All right, so it looks like 80% of us in this space has felt financial shame. 80%. I love asking this question in a big group because it really is a myth buster for a narrative that shame tells us. Because you know what financial shame tells us? Is financial shame tells us we're the only one experiencing it. It's a very, very isolating emotion. But we have data here. 80% of us have felt financial shame. 80%. Financial shame feels like the threat of abandonment. And that's why it's such an isolating feeling. Because when the shame arises, it's telling us like you did something bad or you're bad. And because of it, you might be abandoned. That's a really like life or death type emotion that's going to push us into survival behavior. And our economic culture, which is very much founded on scarcity, competition, and exclusion, if you feel financial shame, this isolated feeling really compounds and it can lead to certain behaviors that we see around money, which is avoidance, freeze, and then soothing behaviors to soothe the pain of the shame. Sometimes these soothing behaviors are like they look a little bit like dopamine seeking behaviors. So, going on and ordering stuff online, distracting you for a minute from the shame. The thing about shame and financial shame in particular is the opposite is something we call pro-social, but that's just a way of saying acceptance and belonging. So I hope from that poll and you seeing that 80% of people in this room have felt financial shame, I hope you feel belonging in that. Because that right there should help minimize the shame that you feel. Financial shame also impacts women very differently. And in agriculture, where resilience is expected, asking for support can feel really, really risky, and that can create more shame. And there's scarcity narratives and gender expectations often go unnamed, but they're really felt. So this is where you start like internalizing some of the financial shame that you have. Something that is really fascinating that we came across in our research as well is that people who've experienced some sort of trauma, and we believe in our work, like when we talk about the word trauma, we're not only talking about like really big catastrophic events. It can be the trauma of being a woman, right? It can come from, it can be generational trauma, it can be societal and systemic. But we have found that people who've experienced trauma can feel shame when good things happen. So you making more money, you becoming a leader in the community that you're working in. This is a good thing happening, but it can create shame. And why is that? Well, we know that many women feel pressure to stay small, invisible, and grateful. And the reason why is somewhere along the way, may have learned that it's safer to keep yourself small. You will survive if you keep yourself small. And this is where when something good happens, the shame can arise. As a result, financial success or recognition can bring discomfort instead of pride. And achievement can feel unsafe in systems that reward self-sacrifice. So let's do another poll. Let's see, is this resonating with you? When you experience financial success or recognition, what comes up? Do you notice this within yourself? Do you feel pride and confidence? Do you feel gratitude mixed with discomfort? Do you feel guilt, shame, or fear of standing out? Is there a pressure to kind of minimize or downplay it? One thing I think about a lot too is like, how many women, like when they're like, oh my gosh, I love your shirt. And you're like, oh yeah, it was on sale. I got it for $10. Or like, oh my gosh, this dinner you made is so delicious. And you're like, oh, it was nothing. It was super, super easy. There's a little bit of like a default minimizing of our efforts, right? Or maybe for you, it just depends on the situation. So I'm curious, what do you notice when financial success or recognition comes up for you? Yeah, big pressure to minimize is the most popular response that we're seeing. And this completely checks out with all the research that we've done. Yeah, pressure to minimize. And the second most popular answer was having gratitude, but mixed with discomfort. Yeah, absolutely. We see that a lot. Yeah, beautiful, beautiful. So, I mentioned earlier when I was talking about my own money story that I had these behaviors that kind of fell under this umbrella of what we call financial fawning. And this shame that you feel, or the desire to like minimize, or feeling grateful but also uncomfortable with financial success and financial confidence and recognition, we would categorize that as financial fawning. And so, financial fawning is a term that we have coined in the Trauma of Money Institute, and it's a response of the nervous system and the brain where we use money as a tool to seek security and attachment. So, this response often manifests as people pleasing, excessive accommodation, prioritizing other needs over their own, even at the expense of their well-being. And in other words, we may use our money as a please, love, and accept me fund in order to avoid conflict or prevent being abandoned, rejected, or shunned. We initially called this financial codependency, but we noticed that the term was frequently misunderstood. So we chose to call it financial fawning, which really establishes a very direct link to this response of fawning, to identify like this is a nervous system response. Like when you go into people pleasing, or when you go into like minimizing yourself, or an overdeveloped sense of responsibility for others, you don't really have a lot of choice in it. It's a response of the nervous system and the brain that thinks it's protecting you and helping you survive. So we also know that fawning can be a preventative strategy. So I'm using the word response, like something comes up and then you financially fawn. You have a lack of boundaries, or you overgive, or you over accommodate. But so that's a response, but we also know that fawning can be a preventative strategy. And what this means is like sometimes it almost gets confused with our personality, where you show up and you're just always the really nice person. You're always so sweet and so accommodating and so pleasant. And this is where this might be like the fawning as a preventative strategy. So the underlying belief is that fawning will ensure safety and prevent another trauma or conflict from happening. Now, how does financial fawning show up? I mean, there's multiple ways it can show up. So, not taking a formal salary to help the farm, overspending, buying things to seek external validation, lack of boundaries around money, avoidance of money conversations or negotiations to maintain harmony. Sometimes it can show up as workaholism. So this was a big one with me. I noticed like before I started doing the journey of this work that we do here, I was definitely a workaholic, and I was not a workaholic because I was trying to acquire as much money as possible. I just really didn't want to disappoint anyone. And so I put in so much effort to the point that it was just not sustainable. And at the end of the day, when you are over accommodating everyone and you have such an like imbalanced, overdeveloped sense of responsibility, what ends up happening is you naturally go into a state of financial avoidance. And the reason why is because you're so exhausted from caretaking everyone that your stuff that you need to take care of for yourself gets deprioritized. So this is where like oftentimes we see people who are financial fawning, they'll often be like late on their taxes, or they're not going to do their own budgets, or they're not flossing their teeth because they're so freaking tired at the end of the day. And so they'll deprioritize some of these things because of the emotional exhaustion of financial fawning. Now, this research from Dr. Gabor Mate, who is a well-known physician that works with trauma and addiction, is absolutely fascinating when it comes to some of the behaviors that we see around financial fawning. So he basically says that all of us humans are really trying to seek attachment. We're trying to seek like attachment with people. So we feel a sense of belonging. Like it is a biological imperative for us to seek connection with people and or connection in community. We want to belong. And sometimes what we will do to seek attachment is we will sell out our authenticity to get the attachment. So this is essentially where we're like suppressing ourselves in order to get attachment. And he has identified some of these traits that he sees when someone is suppressing themselves to get attachment that are the exact same traits that we see in financial fawning. And he has shown in the research, these are also the exact same traits that are seen across all autoimmune diseases. And we know that autoimmune diseases disproportionately impact women. So the first one is suppression of anger, automatic or compulsive concern for the emotional needs of others while ignoring one's own, overdriven, externally focused, multitasking, hyper responsibility, rigid concern for social acceptance, and we justify our existence by doing and giving. And harboring two beliefs: I'm responsible for how others feel and I can't disappoint anyone. Wow, when I first saw this list, I was like, I feel like these are the unspoken rules of how I'm supposed to be in as a woman in society. Like I've been programmed my whole life to be like this. And you're telling me that these are the traits associated with all autoimmune diseases, this suppression of self. So there is a significant cost to the pressure to minimize ourselves. Yeah. Um, and linking this back to shame, the financial shame, one of our like trademark questions that we explore in the Trauma of Money Institute is whose shame is this? This is a very powerful question to ask yourself. When you notice financial shame arising or shame around being a leader or any shame, ask yourself, whose is this? Because the financial shame we rarely carry is, or we carry is rarely our own. It can be generational. What did you learn about money, worth, and security growing up? It can be systemic. How has our economy historically undervalued women's labor? You know, if I'm going out there and I'm making a decision around the investments for my business, something that kind of comes up for me as a woman is sometimes I can over research and go into analysis paralysis before I make a decision. Why do I do that? Because I carry a systemic and a generational narrative that I can't be trusted with money simply because I'm a woman. So now I get the opportunity to be trusted with money. I have to be perfect with it. That's not my shame. That's systemic, societal, generational. And then societal, what messages do we receive that tie net worth to self-worth or that people are entitled to our care even at our own expense? So going back to this, like I just mentioned, the analysis paralysis and having these like perfectionist expectations on the decisions that we make with money, or even, you know, the name of this presentation is financial confidence. Sometimes when we are trying to think about ourselves being financially confident, we may be doing that from a perfectionist lens. And we know perfection is a setup for financial shame. If there is a perfectionist expectation or value around the way we show up as a leader or with money, oftentimes perfectionism, we call this the 3 Ps of perfectionism. Perfectionism leads to procrastination, and then it leads to paralysis. And so the way this works, we call this the compounding financial shame cycle, is we have a perfectionist value of how we're supposed to be with money. If we can't meet that, we shame or shun ourselves, or we believe others are going to shun us. That pain leads to a procrastination. And in this space of procrastination, this is where we're going to seek things to distract ourselves. Like this is where we might go into hoarding or compulsive spending to get that little dopamine hit to distract ourselves. And then from there, we just go into the financial avoidance. And guess what we feel at the other side of financial avoidance? We feel more shame. And then we think to get out of that shame, we have to be perfect in our next step. And then we just get stuck on that cycle. So, how do we get off? Well, there is a ladder. We call it the shame to belonging ladder. And this is where we name the shame to tame the shame. So, what is the behavior that you're feeling shame about? Where is it coming from? Whose shame is this? And have this conversation with yourself with radical honesty. And then from there, reduce that risk of abandonment by meeting yourself with acceptance or empathy. And if you are working with, let's say you have a team that you're managing and you're noticing shame in one of your employees, meeting them with acceptance and empathy is really powerful to minimize that shame so you can help yourself or the other person go to the next right action and get off that cycle. And there's so many different ways to doing this, especially when you're working with someone else. One, self-disclosure. So let's say you're working with another person and you're noticing financial shame in them. You might say something like, yeah, I'm not really perfect with money, or I made this mistake with money, or I tend to overgive sometimes. Self-disclosure is really powerful because what's happening is the other person's not feeling alone. They're not feeling that like isolated feeling of shame. And then another thing that you can do to communicate acceptance is affirming body language, nodding your head yes when someone's sharing something vulnerable to you, just by simply being like, yeah, you know, imagine you're telling me something and I'm just like this. How does it feel to see that versus, yeah, yeah. It's such a different experience for the nervous system. And then normalizing challenges like market fluctuation, financial overwhelm, institutional mistrust, and framing these as systemic outcomes and not personal failings. And then, of course, using inclusive language is try to avoid like deficit-based terms like I have bad habits or poor choices, and try to use more strength-based framing. So, on that, let's just take a moment to maybe come into our body because that was a lot of cognitive. You might be noticing some feelings. You might be noticing some resonance with feeling financial shame. And I'm going to invite you to just do something that we call orienting. So I'm going to invite you, if sight is available to you, to just take a moment to just look around the room, look around your own space, taking your eyes away from Zoom, and just maybe starting on one shoulder and scanning the room, looking around, noticing the textures and colors in the space. And if sight is not available to you, you can do this through sound, noticing the layers of sound in the space. You can do it through scent or touch. We're just orienting our nervous system to the here and now. And then maybe you like to work your way around to the other shoulder and just look behind you. Oh, just signaling to the nervous system, there's not a saber-toothed tiger there right now. Yeah. All right, coming back. We have a couple more minutes before we go into questions, and I just want to give you some like juicy neurobiology around the brain, trauma, and scarcity. So, in the trauma of money, we have this map of what we believe impacts the relationship with money. And I've mentioned this multiple times. It's not just how much financial literacy you have, it's also generational trauma or scarcity, relational, societal, or systemic scarcity. So many different, often overlooked dimensions impact the relationship with money. And we teach this map just so you can have so much compassion for yourself when maybe there is a behavior that you're like, that doesn't feel logically right, but I don't know why I did that. It's coming from so many places, so many different layers. One of the layers that I think you may actually find really interesting is we call it the laws of nature layer. And this is actually a reminder for us to look at nature as a role model for our relationship with money, because a lot of the programming that we get from our dominant economic system is values that are rooted in scarcity and not in like natural ways of being on this earth. Like, for example, one of the values is reciprocity, the law of nature of reciprocity. We find in our dominant economic system, in our money system, reciprocity is very transactional if it exists, and oftentimes it doesn't really exist. And so the law of nature of reciprocity is an important value system that we can pull in from nature. And we actually know that our brain expects reciprocity. And when reciprocity is not present, our nervous system views this as a lack of safety, right? So we might have a little bit of a response where we lose capacity in our decision-making ability if we're interacting with something where reciprocity doesn't feel present. Um, and when we interact with money or people or decision making, that activates our brain into a survival response. So we could call this a trauma response, or we can simply say, our brain's whole job is meant to budget the resources in our body. Like our brain's job constantly is budgeting and reallocating resources for energy management and survival. That's all our brain is doing. It's predicting constantly. And it's predicting based on data it has from the past. Sometimes it gets it wrong, or sometimes it doesn't like right size the prediction. And this is where we maybe go into like a scarcity response or a trauma response that impacts our decision making. So, one way to think about this is the brain might be predicting that there's potential danger or something feels unsafe. And then we lose access to the parts of our brain that help us make decisions, help us regulate our emotions, and helps us with temptation control. And the brain is reallocating the energy into the body to help us maybe like run away, flee, fight, or hide, right? But the thing is with money, those responses are not helpful. We actually need the part of our brain that helps us with long-term decision making and temptation control and the ability to regulate emotions. And this is why learning how the brain works and working with the body is a very powerful financial confidence tool to have. And that's why into 50% of integration is just being like, wow, I notice I'm getting activated right now. How can I support my nervous system to come into a place of regulation so I have more agency? And one thing that's super fascinating that I think is really important to know is that scarcity. And scarcity is present in our economic system. It's also present in farming, but the brain can't tell the difference between real scarcity or perceived scarcity, and scarcity mimics a trauma response in the brain. So when your brain believes it's in scarcity, your ability to make clear decisions gets impacted. You go into like tunnel vision, so you become hyper focused on the here and now, and it's really hard to think about long-term planning. And you're also more likely to act out on temptation. So a lot of the work that we need to do with scarcity is to support our nervous system to come into a place of regulation. And one of the ways that we do this is working with something we call the window of resilience, which is just being able to be like, where's my nervous system at right now? Am I feeling like I want to collapse, freeze? Am I feeling like I want to fight or flight? And what can I do to support my nervous system to come into this optimal space of effectiveness where we can make intentional and wise money decisions? And I want to leave you with a few different ways that we can do this. But when we go into the Q&A period, if you also want to share, like, what are some of the ways that you access your window of resilience. Some of them might be like socializing, breathing, mindfulness, going out in nature. Gut health is one. Physical activity, working with your senses, laughing, challenging your beliefs. And remember, your body and your nervous system literacy is a core component of your financial confidence and your financial literacy. So I am going to pause there. I want to let you know I have given you in these slides so many more reflections and information to go a little bit deeper. So we're not going to get into it today. Purposely, I've purposely given you extra for you to explore if you want to go deeper. So you'll be getting the slides with the recording with these additional reflections. Thank you.
Chantel, thank you so much for all of that wisdom. I have so many notes down here, and I know everybody else does too. There are some great questions that came in through the Q&A. First one I want to start out with is, what are some small starter tips to make better financial decisions?
Yeah. So the one thing I would always say is slow down, notice what's happening in the body, notice some of the thoughts that are present, and some of the feelings that are present before you make a decision. And just that spaciousness that you give yourself can give you a lot of information. Like, am I about to make a decision from a place of fear, from a place of anxiety, from a place of scarcity? And then start to ask yourself, like, where is this coming from? Have I felt this before? Is this a familiar pattern? And then once you start asking those questions, do something to shift the energy in your nervous system. So maybe you go outside, maybe you call a friend to share what's present with you. Maybe you make a cup of tea and put on your favorite music and dance. And once you're feeling more regulated, then go back into your vision and your values. Be like, okay, what's really important to me? And then from there, you're way more resource to make the financial decision you're trying to make.
Absolutely. You had mentioned your own experience with being a financial expert on the outside and then struggling on the inside. What are some of the tips, or do you have any tips for avoiding overspending or impulse spending and coming after Christmas, over gifting? So
Yeah.
maybe we don't do this again next year.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So one is one of the most helpful things for me around overspending was understanding how dopamine actually works. So oftentimes I had I had noticed like I had slowed down the whole process of why I was buying something by really like looking at it like, okay, what am I feeling before I have that intense desire to buy or to give something to someone? What am I feeling? And we always say in trauma money, like, what's the why of the buy? Why am I actually doing this? And then I started to be like, oh, wow, I'm noticing when I really want to go buy something, I'm feeling tired. I'm feeling lonely. I'm feeling fear. I'm feeling anxiety. I also might be feeling like a low dopamine state, which we call like lethargic. It almost can feel like a little bit of depression. And then I would pay attention to what would happen to my energy level when I would buy something. And I would notice when I would go buy something, I felt this like increase in energy, like an adrenaline. And I'm like, oh, yeah, I am seeking the increase in my dopamine baseline. And then I would pay attention to how long that increase in energy would last. And I noticed it didn't last very long. And so that made me really see like, wow, this actually is not giving me what I need. It only gives me what I need for like 24 hours. And then I still go back to feeling those feelings. And it was through that experience that I'm like, huh, I don't want to deny myself like the need to increase my dopamine. I don't want to deny myself the need to soothe. But what I want to do is I want to find a way to soothe myself or give myself the dopamine that has less negative consequences. because I was doing the shopping to the point where I was like racking up a bunch of credit card debt, right? So I'm like, okay, what can I choose to get this like soothing dopamine that's not going to impact me in a bad way? Because it's not bad that you're soothing or wanting more dopamine. It's just like, can you choose something with less impact?
Right. Less financial repercussion
Yeah,
afterward,
exactly.
for sure.
Exactly. Yeah.
Another question here is, can you give an example of a strength-based response?
Yeah, yeah. So rather than being like, oh, that was a bad choice, you could say something like if you make a choice around money, you're like, that was a bad choice. A strength-based response would be like, wow, I was clearly looking to soothe myself in that moment. And I'm really glad that I was able to find a way to resource myself. But in the future, I'm going to acknowledge that I need a different approach to resourcing. But I'm really glad that I like honored that part of me that needed some care. I just now have more information to choose a different path forward.
Absolutely. I think what I'm taking from this is giving ourselves permission to be curious, right, about our feelings and asking ourselves these questions before we go on and judge ourselves or judge others, which I'm a podcaster, I'm an interviewer, so I'm curious by nature. So I like being curious with ourselves too.
Yeah, beautiful. I love that reflection.
Yeah. Do you have any advice or suggestions to get out of the perfection paralysis?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's a hard one because it's very ingrained in us. It, we think that like to be safe, we have to really like censor or contort ourselves to be a certain way to be accepted. And I think something that I've done because I can go into perfectionist mode a lot is I try to like really identify the spaces where I get to be messy and not perfect. And I really pay attention to that experience of like, where am I at where I get to be messy and not perfect? And what's the outcome of that? Because the thing is if I don't have to be perfect, guess what I get to be? What you said, Caitlin, more curious. You get to be more of like a curious scientist, right? And I think about the amount of creativity that can come out of that environment versus the limited creativity that can come out of perfectionism. And so we in the trauma of money, we have a six-step method that we use when working with our relationship with money. And the last step we call the refinement phase. And this is an antidote to perfectionism, where it reminds us, like, okay, whatever I'm working on, like maybe it's a budget or it's a goal or it's a conversation I need. Step six of the journey of that is going to be taking time to recalibrate, review, and refine. And so this is allowing us to have feedback loops for refinement. If we had perfectionism, we couldn't have feedback loops for curiosity or refinement. So I've really done this whole shift around seeing it as perfectionism as limiting.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It really, in the grand scheme of things, it really doesn't help your long-term goals or your long-term visions.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's one question left that I want to ask you because I think it's important for a lot of women in this room to hear. In a family run or a partnership based operation, money decisions are deeply tied to relationships. And you often hear people say that they avoid certain conversations to keep the peace.
Mhm.
From your experience, what does that trade off actually cost emotionally and financially when harmony starts to take priority over sustainability?
Well, I mean, I'm thinking a little bit about Dr. Gabor Mate's research around autoimmune disease and the suppression of self. If we're constantly, I think there's a time and place to keep the peace, but I think if it's coming at the cost to like you and being living your authentic like values, then that's going to have long-term impacts on you. right? We're going to see burnout. We're going to see like impacts to your health and to your ability to be creative, to your ability to create a life that's in alignment with your value system. And so I think there's a lot of beautiful harmony that can happen in families and in romantic relationships around money. And it starts with like acknowledging the way human beings show up with each other and their own and the money stories that each like identity and human being is bringing into the space. And once you start like doing this more of this work, you really develop a deep level of empathy and compassion, not only for yourself and for others. And so when we talk about like how to interact with money and relationships and power dynamics, we really explore like what is it like to have different types of conversations that are not focused on specifically the money, but like how do you view power? Like what are some of the things that you've learned from society around money? What are some of the things that you think might get in the way of this relationship? What are some values that are really important to you? What are some narratives that you may have learned in the past that might not be helpful in the way we're interacting together as a family? So there's so much there. There's so much there, and there's a lot of opportunity for the creation of beautiful harmony between family and relationships around money, but it takes work. Just like, couples go to couples therapy, it takes work.
Absolutely. Thank you. We ran over time for that question, but I thought it was super important for your wisdom around that. And Chantel, thank you so much for everything today. I have so many more questions, and I am so looking forward to diving more into your work. Thank you again so much for your knowledge.
Thank you all so much for being here today. And thank you for your intro.
Well, that does it for us. Thank you all so much for being here today. Thank you so much to Chantel. I hope you were able to take away actionable insights that will give you confidence when operating your farm.